Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. Your commitment to advancing mental health care is truly inspiring. At Iconotes, we're passionate about providing mental health professionals like you with the most clinically robust and intuitive mental health care software available. From psychiatrists to therapists, nurse practitioners to social workers, Iconotes offers a comprehensive solution tailored to your practice's needs. With Iconotes, you can write a flawless note in less than 3 minutes, and without typing a single word. Iconotes was designed specifically to help mental health professionals write comprehensive notes quickly. Iconotes also provides a complete practice management solution with user-friendly scheduling, secure document management, HIPAA-compliant messaging, a certified patient portal, and more, so you can spend less time on paperwork and more time helping your patients. Try us free at iconotes.com/try-us.
Welcome, everyone. Good morning. We're so happy you guys are here with us today. I'm Angela Kostelic. I'm on the marketing team here at Iconotes, and we are thrilled to have this webinar for you today on understanding narcissistic abuse. And we have a great speaker. She's been with us a few times now, Kaylee Cron. And she is a wonderful speaker. You guys are in for a treat. Let us know in the comments where you're all coming from. It's just really neat to see all the different people that come from all around the world. Good morning, Christy, Rachel, Leslie, Trina. I hope I said that right. All right, Alabama. Oh, 2 from Alabama. Okay. Oh, all over Chicago. I'm right by Chicago. You're my neighbors. Southern Illinois. Wonderful. Great. It's so good to have you all here today. And if you don't mind putting in the chat for Kaylee, what type of clinician you are, that helps her out as she does her presentation to know who's watching. If you don't mind putting that in, that will really help her a lot. So to tell you about Kaylee, she has worked as a grief counselor at a nonprofit hospice, guiding individuals through their grief journeys. Currently, she serves as an author, speaker, and organizer of events that provide space for acknowledging and processing grief. She's been featured in various media outlets, including articles, podcasts, magazines, and all to amplify the conversation around grief. And she holds a master's in social work and is a certified grief counselor through the American Institute for Healthcare Professionals. So welcome, Kaylee. We're so glad you're here with us again. And I am turning the floor to you.
Thanks so much, Angela. And thank you, everyone, for letting us know where you're coming from and also what your specialty areas are. Your licensures are always so helpful to kind of know where we're at as far as a baseline. I'm wondering where we're at as far as working with domestic violence or intimate partner violence. I know that it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Still, as we are still in October. I honestly thought it was November for a second. Wow. But we are just wanting to talk a little bit about intimate partner violence in honor of this observance and just the care that is needed for individuals who are impacted by all kinds of intimate partner violence and abuse. And specifically, we're going to focus in on narcissistic abuse because it is I think something that we talk about culturally. I know narcissistic abuse, gaslighting, those kind of things are hot button topics on all the social media channels, but I really wanted to make sure that we had some solid foundations clinically as we potentially will see clients who are victims of this kind of abuse in our sessions. Angela already did a great job at introducing me, but I did want to just mention, when I was putting together this content, really thinking through this presentation, I had a client that really popped out to me, and I want you to keep in mind, if you do not work in the domestic violence arena, if that's not really the specialty area that you all inhabit, that's okay, because you still will come into contact with individuals who are processing abuse. from many different avenues. And so I had a woman who lost her husband. And as we were going through the grief process, it was a bit odd, right? Like she was experiencing more relief than stress, more feeling alleviated from the relationship. And the more we dug in, the more we realized that she had been a victim of narcissistic abuse for decades within her marriage. And I think when we were able to really uncover that experience for her, her learning process and her ability to really process through the grief that she was feeling, not just of her husband dying, but also of the relationship she thought she had, the relationship she wanted to have. We were able to really unpeel all of those layers of her grief, and it was very, very beneficial. So I think it's just important as we're walking through today, just to think of the different cases where you may come into contact with individuals who don't even realize that this is something that they are experiencing or have experienced in the past. So I wanted to give just a really brief introduction of intimate partner violence. And so what that looks like is any kind of physical, psychological, or sexual harm that is inflicted on somebody in an intimate relationship with another. When we look at the statistics, there's 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men are going to experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. That's a really important statistic because I think, of course, yes, it impacts women a little bit more, but men are also victims of intimate partner violence. And I do think that's a very important distinction to make, is to not necessarily cut that out of the realm of possibilities when you're working with men or masculine presenting individuals. We also know that intimate partner violence impacts 40 to 60% of murders of women. When we're looking at large cases, when we're looking at situations where women are harmed, oftentimes it is their intimate partner, and that is a jarring thing, I think, when we don't realize that that is really such a prevalent issue that occurs for women in relationship. It can feel really jarring because in our minds and in our hearts, relationships are meant to be supportive, healing, a resting space. But for those individuals who are experiencing intimate partner violence, it is the opposite of that and can have very dire consequences. So this is a really, really serious issue, and it is not to be taken lightly. I want to also speak to the addition of, we're not just talking about physical violence here. When we look at abuse in whole, we see emotional and psychological abuse as just as severe, and the consequences just as lasting, if not more so, because of the psychological toll that it takes on our hearts and minds. So why are we talking about narcissistic abuse specifically? I think that we want to pay attention to certain personalities, diagnoses, and behaviors that we can kind of keep track of. So as you have clients in session who potentially speak to, I'm in an abusive relationship, or I have been, or I don't feel safe around my partner, we can kind of arm ourselves with the information of different categories of abuse and what that can look like, so we're not zooming in on one very specific type. And so today, really looking at that narcissistic abuse cycle is very important, and it is not the only important abuse cycle to pay attention to. And so I want to just speak to that as well. We will be zooming in today, but by no means does that encompass all kinds of intimate partner violence. But when we're thinking about narcissistic abuse, it is a very special form because of the intentional, targeted, chronic manipulation and emotional abuse that a narcissistic individual perpetrates on their partner over time and systemically. And there is a strategy to it that plays out. And so it isn't just a, oops, I manipulated you once, or oops, I discarded your feelings a couple times. This is intentional. It's something that an individual does on purpose and through a cycle, because that is what they know works for them to get their needs met. We also look at, victims of narcissistic abuse, and we see long-term trauma, PTSD, depression, and anxiety in those individuals, again, because they're exposed to such a long-term form of abuse that is like very confusing. I think that's really important to also pay attention to, is it's like the person being abused doesn't always realize that's what's happening. And then all of a sudden it is, and then it isn't. And it just feels like, what is going on here? And it can make a victim doubt themselves and what they know to be true. So narcissistic abuse, when we look at the prevalence, it definitely is there. We have about 6% of the population may exhibit narcissistic personality traits just based on that DSM criteria. They'll knock on all those doors. But when we also look at domestic violence surveys and what people are experiencing more culturally, they found that emotional abuse is about half of all intimate partner violence, with narcissistic tactics often being used. So while someone might not be a diagnosable narcissist, they exhibit personality traits, behaviors. They've kind of caught on to that cycle of abuse, and that it works, and why it works, and how it kind of takes control of the person that they are victimizing. We also know that narcissistic personality disorder affects men more often than it affects women. There's a lot of research, a lot of interesting stuff if you want to dig into personality disorders and where we lean based on different genetic markers and our sex assigned at birth, and how we kind of lean into different ones, but specifically narcissist tendencies are more prevalent in men by and large. So we kind of want to do a side-by-side comparison of narcissistic abuse versus other forms of intimate partner violence. And of course, there is a Venn diagram. But if we're kind of setting them side by side, there is different forms of abuse, as we've mentioned, and the narcissistic abuse. And I'm not saying that there is never cases where a narcissist is physically violent. I want to speak to that as well. There is a never category of a spectrum of abuse that is engaged in within any intimate partner relationship, depending on the person committing those heinous things. But when we think about narcissistic abuse, they really focus on that psychological tactics around manipulation, gaslighting, control. And victims identify with physical violence more than they feel like they can really put their finger on emotional abuse and the cycle specifically of narcissistic abuse, because it is, as I said, very confusing. And further into this webinar, we're going to dig into each of those tactics, and we'll talk through why it feels so confusing to the person that it is happening to. While victims of this abuse, while they're in it, may not be able to identify that this is an abusive situation, we know as clinicians, researchers, people in the field who have been here and have been kind of seeing trends, see coercive control and emotional abuse as very much right in line with that physical abuse. And narcissist personalities really fall within that category in the majority. As I mentioned, the psychological impacts of narcissistic abuse is insidious. It isn't screaming, yelling, berating on a constant basis. It is this long-term confusing process that pulls people in and then pushes them where they want them to go, pushes them away, and then pulls them back in, right? And it's very confusing. And victims don't often understand what is going on when it is happening. And so, as a result of this experience, they will come out, fingers crossed, of these relationships with very low self-esteem and very low self-worth. And that is an intentional impact by an individual perpetrating this victimization. We also have complex PTSD because, again, it's really hard to put your finger on it. It's really difficult to know what's happening at the moment. It's traumatic for a lot of really confusing reasons that take a lot of time to dig into, but digging into it is very traumatic. And so that complexity is really there. We also have feelings like long-term confused, self-doubt. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I'm telling people. Maybe I'm making it a bigger deal than it needs to be. Maybe I should give it another shot because I probably overreacted is absolutely, again, an incredibly intentional tactic. And then at the end, anxiety and depression. Overarchingly, when you doubt yourself, when you are unsure of yourself, when you have been isolated from friends and family, and again, we'll talk about that tactic, you don't have a lot of places to turn, and so you turn inside. And then on the inside, you don't have that self-worth. You don't have the confidence to kind of know yourself and to know that you can handle situations or that you even want to. And so that is really a very, very significant marker when we're looking at like that anxiety and depression coming up. And then finally, there is unfortunately trauma bonding that can occur when, victims of this type of abuse feel deeply connected to the person that is abusing them. And it is strategic. A narcissist wants you to stay and wants you to feel connected to them as a result of the push and pull that they do within this cycle. And so they make their victim very reliant on the love that they show because the love is so incredible. It feels so good for the person that you care about, that you've invested so much of your relationship in, to finally be back, right? Back to showing you who they were in the first place. And then the cycle continues. And so the he can change idea or she can change idea can be very much, it makes it difficult to walk away when that love bombing has occurred. We also have a couple statistics specifically within narcissistic abuse and the victims that experience that. We have, looking at just specifically emotional and psychological abuse, we have very, very close side-by-sides. 48.4% of women and 48.8% of men, so pretty statistically insignificant difference, experience emotional or psychological abuse from their partners. When we also look at individuals who have experienced family violence also within that, we have about 18 to 20% of people reported emotional or psychological abuse, specifically within that like narcissistic traits of their abuser. And that is a really interesting statistic when we go back and look at that 6% of people are diagnosable narcissists, and then you have about 18 to 20%. That kind of tracks when you think about the number of relationships or people who are not diagnosable narcissists, but they do exhibit those traits. You can definitely see that correlation. It's not incredibly common, but it's incredibly harmful to experience these things. And I'm so thankful that we hear many, many stories about it because it shows that victims are coming out of it with a better understanding of what happened to them. Unfortunately, survivors of narcissistic abuse are they struggle deeply with leaving the relationship. And we've talked about that a little bit, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into that emotional abuse and manipulation that occurs. But they struggle to leave for a couple of reasons. They believe change can happen. They've seen better versions and they don't want to walk away just in case that better version comes back. Emotional entrapment can occur. So kind of meaning like, if you leave, here's what'll happen to me. All of the things that kind of make someone that you love not want to go is, I want to make sure you're okay. And then finally, fear of retaliation. If you leave, I will show the photos that we took. I will tell all of your friends and family what you've ever said about them. Things that would make a person feel a lot of shame and a lot of fear around potentially walking away. So, when we look at intimate partner violence, narcissistic abuse can be overlooked. I think it is less so overlooked more recently as we're learning more, as we're having more people come forward with their experiences, specifically, I think, through social media and those kind of things. We are seeing it more often, and so it's less overlooked, but it can be minimized. It goes unreported and minimized because emotional abuse is very, very hard to quantify. When you've been hit. You can show the marks on your body. You can't show the marks on your heart and your mind and your exhaustion and your relationships. You can't show that in a way that is very quantifiable. It's very difficult, number one, to report it and to get any kind of help in alleviating that abuse from happening to you. But it's also very hard for people to see it, right? For people on the outside of that relationships. Victims may also not recognize their abuse until years after either the relationship has ended, or in my client's case, the individual had died, and they were able to come up for air and look around and say, that was not normal. That did not feel good to me. That was not a healthy situation. And then it's finally time to start unpacking. But when you're in it, it's very, very difficult. We also have, stigma and mental and a struggle to say I was a victim of intimate partner violence. I think that can feel very naming for people. It can feel very identity forming, and that is not typically something you want your identity to be associated with. But it also creates a situation where narcissists get to continue their cycles of abuse, which is very unfortunate. Okay, so now we're going to dive into what narcissists do that create all of these heinous impacts that we've just talked about. As I'm going through, please feel free to add questions to the Q&A box, not to the chat, so that I can keep track. If you're putting your questions in the chat, they get lost. Okay. So my hope at the end of this webinar is for you to have just a deeper understanding of the scope of narcissistic abuse within the context of intimate partner violence, recognize the prevalence and hidden nature of abuse within these relationships, and to understand how profound the psychological and emotional effects are on survivors of this. Okay, so laying it all out, just kind of in a very brief format, we have common tactics of narcissistic abuse. I think there's probably ones that feel very familiar, as well as ones that do not feel as familiar. And don't worry, because we are going to go into each of these and kind of define them out, like really massage out this a little bit more. But we look at manipulation, gaslighting, love bombing, devaluation, and discard. So the first one we're going to dig a little bit deeper into is gaslighting. So this undermining of the reality that their partner is believing to be true. We look at that in definition. It's just a psychological tactic where the abuser causes the victim to doubt their perceptions of reality. We see that, and if you remember, we kind of look at the impact of narcissistic abuse and the self-doubt. This gaslighting is where this comes into play most profoundly, because the abuser will constantly be questioning their victim's memory, their perspective, their history, what they said, what they believe, what they did, their shared memories, to the point where the victim doesn't actually trust themselves anymore. We have examples of gaslighting, which can be denying the truth. That never happened. When you try to point out that you have been harmed by your abuser, they say that didn't happen, or it didn't happen the way that you're describing it, or you're overreacting, which is a minimizing of the feelings. Like, okay, it happened, but not in the way you're telling, and you're making me seem like the bad guy. And then blaming the victim. It wouldn't have happened if you wouldn't have pushed me. And you know that that's something that triggers me. And so it's kind of like making it their fault that bad things happened. So it has this effect on people: self-doubt, confusion, and really difficult time making decisions, and feelings of guilt and shame. So we have a situation where the victim of gaslighting does not trust their own thoughts, feelings, memories. And that's a very, very difficult person to have the confidence to walk away from a situation like that. So we have kind of this dual experience with love bombing and then devaluation. So when we look at that abuse cycle, love bombing is the start, devaluation is the middle, love bombing is the end, right? And it continues. So love bombing is intense affection, attention, gifts, praise. You're incredible. The goal is to make the individual feel very special, very loved, unique, soulmates, just really talking up the relationship, or how the perpetrator feels about their victim, in such a way that kind of from the outside, people can look in and be like, that's weird. That's a weird thing that you're experiencing. But to the individual, it can feel overwhelmingly powerful of, finally, I found somebody who feels this way about me. We desire genuine love bombing, right? Like, we desire people to love us so much and immediately and quickly and deeply. And so that is intoxicating. It feels really good. And unfortunately, within that cycle of love bombing comes devaluation. And so that is a gradual withdrawal of all of that love and affection, of all of that praise, of all of that holding you up high, of making you feel the best you've ever felt, and pulling you down systemically through shame, criticism, belittling, questioning, insults, digs, things that, using things that were shared in confidence because you trusted them against you to pull you down further and make you feel worse about yourself. It can feel to an individual who's experienced this like a complete 180, an incredibly shocking experience for someone who loved you so much to turn around and hurt you so purposefully. And the reason they do this is to destabilize their victim emotionally. They don't want you confident. They don't want you feeling good about yourself or feeling deeply and well loved. But they also don't want you to only feel bad. Because in typical relationships, when you only feel bad, you leave. And so that cycle maintains the relationship in the way that the narcissistic abuser wants it to be maintained. Okay, so isolation is a very important component of narcissistic abuse. The tactic is that the abuser creates wedges within their victims' support systems, including their friends and family, in a way that distances the victim from anyone else that they might turn to in the event that they are upset, angry, hurt, or feeling like they might want to leave. They create a situation where no matter how well supported the person in relationship with the narcissistic abuser is, by the end, in an ideal situation for a narcissist, they have nobody but the narcissist. They don't trust they don't trust anyone else. They also do not seek out those relationships because they don't trust them, but also because they've been so isolated and they're so distanced from them that it feels like too far of a leap to ever go back to that support. So some examples of tactics used within that are just undermining that relationship. So making you feel like, wow, it's kind of weird that your friends would say that about you, and really point out and nitpick things that the victim might not ever have picked up on or thought was odd. But when someone they love deeply and care about points it out, that's a red flag. And so they'll start to kind of plant these seeds of doubt around loyalty, trust within that friendship of they don't actually like you, just so you know. Like they're talking about you behind your back. They're meeting up with each other, and you are not a part of what you think you're a part of. And then from there, controlling communication. So they'll look at phone calls, text messages, emails, social media pages to make sure that their partner, their victim, is only communicating in the way that the abuser deems appropriate. And by that, very, very little, and not authentically. And so they'll read a text, let's say, to a person's mother, and they'll say, "Why would you tell her you had a bad day? She's going to think that has to do with me." And there's an explosion, there's a blow up, and the victim does not reach out to her mother again because she doesn't want to upset her partner. So then there is a distance made between that relationship. And then finally, we have geographic isolation, which can be moving to another area. We look at individuals in the military system, and this is not to say that military personnel are perpetrators, but if they are a perpetrator and they are in the military, moving around the country to different stations with their partner is a really convenient tactic. Otherwise, you have just moving to different towns, moving further and further away from friends and family, moving further and further away from places that the victim feels very comfortable and supported. And so that physical distance, while also monitoring communication, while also making the victim feel like nobody actually cares about them, is an incredibly effective tool to make sure that the victim is wholly reliant on the abuser. The purpose of all of this is to create that dependence on the abuser, and for the abuser to be the only person that the victim has, which then makes it harder for a victim to leave. Okay, so I think we're talking about this, and if you have not experienced any form of abuse through a partner, it can be very difficult to see these things from the outside and say, well, I would never stay. Why do you stay? And you want to kind of shake the person and get them to leave because you can't relate to the amount of, specifically within this intimate partner violence, the emotional manipulation that has occurred systemically and over time. We have victims who feel deeply connected to their abuser in ways that we can't even understand and we can't talk them out of. This happens through that intermittent reinforcement of love bombing, devaluation, moving you away from all of your friends and family, making you doubt every single thing that you believe so that you are wholly reliant on your abuser for your sense of reality. You can see those signs of trauma bonding when you are supporting a client, let's say, in a domestic violence situation or an abusive relationship, through them communicating this uncanny, strong connection to their abuser, despite everything that went on. But they're my best friend. But they're my person. They're all I have. They get me deeply. They know me better than anybody else knows me. And they really do believe these things. And so they kind of have this very strong belief that they're deeply bonded to the person that is abusing them. Then we have the justification of the behavior. And that is where the gaslighting and manipulation comes in. They hurt me because I did A, B, and C. They wouldn't have done that if I hadn't done this. I'm probably wrong. And they're right. And I'm overreacting. And even when a victim is not with their abuser in the room, the remnants of that psychological abuse maintains, persists, does not go away, because it isn't just something the victim is doing in front of the abuser because they want to perform. They deeply, deeply integrate what has happened to them and what they believe about themselves as a result of what the abuser has given them to believe about themselves is so deeply ingrained that they don't have a different perspective, specifically when they have this bond. And even as the abuse gets worse and worse and worse, there is a fundamental difficulty, discomfort, hesitancy to leave that relationship for all of the reasons we've already talked about. There is a reliance and a bond and a connection that is formed as a result of all of these tactics. And the cycle, when we really zoom out and look at it, is the idealization. We look at the love bombing, all of the incredible feelings of warmth, how great you are, followed by, actually, here's all the ways you could be better. Here's all the things that are bad about you. And here's all the people that actually agree with me and think you're terrible. And then discard. We're done here. But it leaves the victim wanting to come back because that idealization they know is right around the corner. Heavy stuff. I think about this topic and it is hard to picture an individual living this every single day and the difficulty that they must experience both emotionally and psychologically while also being isolated from everybody who loves them genuinely and deeply. We have short-term effects that include anxiety, depression, confusion. They don't trust other people, and they don't feel like they have any self-worth. And that, to just live in that, think about that for a day. You don't trust yourself, you don't trust others, and you have no value. And living in that mentally, psychologically, emotionally. Then we look long term, as this abuse is not short. It's not that happened for about a week. If you're lucky, it happened for about a week. To the long-term effects of this type of abuse can include complex PTSD. We're looking at feeling like you're right back in that space and time with that person, experiencing those things, flashbacks, nightmares, and that physiological response to being abused. Hypervigilance and constantly being on edge, because you don't actually know within an abuse cycle when the good part ends and the bad part begins. And so you will always be kind of on the edge of your seat, waiting to find out, where are we at? Are we going to have a good day or a bad day? And so even outside of that abuse, like let's say best case scenario, this individual leaves, they are still going to experience that form of hypervigilance of always feeling like they need to know how everybody's doing, test the temperature of the room. I saw this quote that said, just because you can read the energy in the room doesn't mean it's your responsibility to fix the energy in the room. And that is where the boundary of people have bad days, bad things happen. There's good days and there's bad days, but a victim of this kind of abuse feels like it's their job to fix all those bad days, and make sure that they're like emotionally monitoring others on a regular basis. And then finally, difficulty forming healthy future relationships because of the lack of trust in not only themselves, but other people, to not do that to them again. It is hard enough to get out of an abusive relationship. And so the idea of potentially putting yourself in a situation where you are back there is a devastating thought. But also because of that, like very prolonged, very unique form of abuse, it is difficult to know what healthy looks like, to know what love, genuine love, should feel like, because you have been spoon-fed a very different form that is not genuine. It's very, very difficult to rebuild a relationship that is healthy. Oh, best case scenario. I want to hold space for this being the best case scenario because not everybody leaves. And that is a mental health professional and the general public, very, very hard pill to swallow. But in the best cases, individuals who have been victims of narcissistic abusers are able to get free through a couple of modalities and also some self-work. So I think number one is awareness. It is hard to remain in an abuse cycle when your awareness that it is happening, your bird's eye view, and your ability to look down and say, hey, I've seen this. I know what this is. I know what is happening. That awareness being raised and kind of clicked on allows the victim to start kind of realizing what is going on and pick up on these patterns and to realize that it has very little to do with them at all. This can be supported through the next three, right? So we have number one, support networks. When a victim who has been isolated comes out, gets this bird's eye view and starts to look around, they also think, I gotta talk this out. I've got to reconnect. I miss my mom. They reach out because we have deep connections to people in this world that even though there is an interruption, that outreach when that happens is so essential to helping the victim get out of that relationship, get out of that cycle. Reconnecting with those family and friends also reminds them of who they were before they were convinced of how awful they are. And that is beautiful to have a reminder. Beautiful and painful, right? The next tool that helps get a victim out of this abuse cycle is boundaries. And this is hard. Even when you are not a victim of abuse, boundaries are hard. And so to be able to set firm limits, to remove that reinforcement of their behavior, to remove the active participation in the abuse cycle is huge. And then finally, therapeutic support. It is amazing when a victim of abuse comes to a mental health professional for support, and to also hold space for this is not short term. This is a long-term, systemic, process-oriented, trust-building, self-esteem raising, trauma-informed process. It is multi-layered and it is not easy to support victims of intimate partner violence and specifically narcissistic abuse. So when we look at the different supports that an individual can reach out for, we're not going to dive super deep into this because we clearly don't have time. So we have therapy and specific counseling. So we have trauma therapists, domestic violence counselors. You have people who are very specifically skilled in supporting an individual who has been through this journey. We also have, domestic hotlines and shelters. And I do want to call out, we have a handout in the tab of resources for all forms of intimate partner violence. So please, if you have any inclination that you may interface with an individual who has been a victim of abuse, download that resource so that you have it to pull from, because there's for different communities. There are resources for the LGBTQ community. There's resources for the military community, etc. And so just please take a moment to download that. And then finally, we have community resources that can be pulled upon, which include support groups to be able to sit in a room with other people who share a similar experience and realize that you are not alone and you are deeply seen and understood by other people is groundbreaking. And then there are also educational programs that help people recognize that emotional abuse and help build their resilience back up, build their self-esteem back up. And these are really incredible programs that people can sign up for and really learn. So key takeaways for the day. Narcissistic abuse is pervasive, and it is a significant form of intimate partner violence. It involves emotional manipulation, gaslighting, devaluation, and isolation. Victims often experience deep psychological wounds, and it is very difficult to leave. And healing requires awareness, support systems, and a professional intervention, or not potentially multiple professional interventions. Okay, that was a lot of heavy, icky feeling content. So I'm going to take a moment to go through the Q&A. Oh gosh, okay. Okay. The first question is, I am dealing with a domestic violence client right now. What do you do when the partner wants to insert themselves into therapy and force me to see things his way? This is hard. This is kind of where we have the therapeutic alliance that you have with your client and strong boundaries come into play. And so one thing that kind of comes to mind is it sounds like your client is still in this domestic violence relationship. And so number one, want to flag safety? Would the decision to not allow the partner to come into session put your client in harm's way? And that always needs to be at the very top of your list when working with domestic violence. But then secondarily, is this something that the client wants? If they are still actively in that relationship, they may want their partner in those sessions to get help with communicating to their partner. And so you as the clinician really get to flex all of your strong boundaries, all of your rerouting of conversations. It is hard. It is hard because you have this bond with your client. That is clear. There's a therapeutic alliance. You want the best for ostensibly her. And her partner is wanting to come into the session. As a clinician, it is very difficult to not want to be on your client's side. And I also feel like I know that if you do not have a background in couples counseling and therapy, it is essential that you refer out. That is also a really important thing. So if you don't have a baseline, like I don't work with couples, that's not even in my skill set, and that's okay. You should not be doing that specifically with very high risk clients and partners. So that's kind of encompassing of do it if you are prepared, equipped, and have the background to do it. Potentially, if you're able to hold space for the conversation that's occurring, and if you are able to not want to fight your client's partner to make sure he sees things her way, because as a therapist, we are there to act as mirrors and to support the communication, specifically in couples counseling, between the two. And so, in my opinion, if you already have this person as an ongoing client, it would be wise to support your client solely and then refer them to couples support, relationship counseling, those kind of things. Because it's hard to maintain that therapeutic alliance with your client while also holding space for the person you know is hurting her. Is there any statistics on those who work in mental health who have suffered from narcissistic abuse? I'd be interested to see it. I've been looking into that, and as I see more of my clients, I also see therapists who have experienced this. Hey, I believe that as therapists, we come in to this work largely due to our own personal experiences and how we want to soften the world for the next people who come through. I know for me as a grief counselor, my grief was my biggest tool as a clinician. And for many people who work within the domestic violence arena, many have personal lived experiences. I don't know what the statistics are, but that can be incredibly healing and supportive to new people coming in. But I'd be interested to know that too. Thanks, Leslie. Okay, we have just a few more minutes and I need to play a recording at the end of this. So let me just go through a couple questions, just see if there's any like high level. Okay. Okay. This is an interesting question. The term narcissist is overly used today, especially in abusive situations. How do we determine whether it is really a narcissist? And is it worth it to explain to the victim whether or not their partner meets criteria for being a narcissist? This is a really interesting question because it's kind of multi-layered. So number one, you are right. The term narcissist is used just as much as someone says, oh, and I'm going to trigger warning because I'm going to say things that I don't believe, but this is what we say culturally. Oh, I'm so OCD. I can't not wash the dishes before I go to bed. We use clinical terms in our cultural conversational settings as a way to, I think, be a little plucky, but also to like help act as a comparison of like, hey, I'm doing this thing that I see in some ways compared to this other thing. And so this kind of like helps paint a better picture of my perspective on my behavior, can be really harmful within the mental health community and for people who are actually experiencing situations like OCD or narcissistic abuse specifically, because it's minimizing. To have people just bring it up kind of willy-nilly, oh, he was a narcissist, can be really minimizing to individuals who are victims of diagnosed long-term narcissistic abuse. So that in and of itself, though the use of clinical terms in a plucky way is a very difficult thing to kind of navigate. But it also introduces the concepts of, for this example, being a narcissist. And so you're in a relationship, it's not going well. He's kind of a jerk. And he like doesn't agree on the things that we're fighting about. Is he a narcissist? Is he not a narcissist? The second part of that question is, how do you determine whether they are or are not a narcissist? And is it worth it to help your client see whether or not they are a narcissist? Maybe. Number one, is it important to your client? Is it more important for your client to feel seen, heard, deeply understood, validated, and armed with the resources they need to navigate that relationship that they're in? Or is it more important for you and your client to dig deep into a person who is not present's personality disorder, potentially? Probably not. When I am in session with a client, and I did grief counseling, and so I heard some really wild stories about people who could never tell me otherwise because they had died, right? And I made a conscious decision of like, it doesn't actually matter what the facts are. I'm here to support my client's experience with whatever we're working through their lens. And so if through that work, I am validating, I'm supporting, I am recognizing, that is the most important thing. And what would be inappropriate is for me as a clinician to diagnose a person who is not in session with me. And when that is not my role, to diagnose narcissistic personality disorder. So all of that to say, it may feel important, but at the end of the day, the way we support our clients is by validating their experiences and not focusing on, all right, let's pick apart this person who isn't present and isn't in this space. I think that can be really unhelpful to progress that you can make with your client when we're focusing on them. And if they are in fact victims of abuse, they need to focus on them because that's probably the only time they're doing that. And that's all we have time for. I am going to thank you all so much. We're going to play a brief clip. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your questions. Thank you so much for being here. And I will see you next time. Take care.
Thank you for watching today. We hope you enjoyed our webinar. At Iconotes, we're passionate about providing mental health professionals like you with the most clinically robust and intuitive mental health care software available. From psychiatrists to therapists, nurse practitioners to social workers, Notes offers a comprehensive solution tailored to your practice's needs. With Notes, you can write a flawless note in less than 3 minutes, and without typing a single word. Notes was designed specifically to help mental health professionals write comprehensive notes quickly. Notes also provides a complete practice management solution with user-friendly scheduling, secure document management, HIPAA-compliant messaging, a certified patient portal, and more, so you can spend less time on paperwork and more time helping your patients. Try us free at iCanotes.com/try-us.